Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Clémence Michallon. Clémence is the author of The Quiet Tenant, a USA Today and international bestseller and nominee for the Hammett Prize. She's also a freelance journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Time Magazine, The Independent, and more. Clémence was born and raised near Paris, has lived in New York since 2014, and became a U.S. citizen in 2022. Her new book, Our Last Resort, is out on July 8. Welcome, Clémence.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this intro and thank you for having me on the show.
So fun. So I read, we haven't actually met in real life, but I read The Quiet Tenant. No, that is not true. Actually, I came to your paperback release of The Quiet Tenant because I was living in New York that May,
Yes,
last May, right?
yes, that's correct. Yes.
So I saw you. We met maybe like for 1 second, but I
Yes, I think we've briefly met, but we haven't like unpacked anything yet. So
no.
we're fresh for this conversation.
This is so fun. I loved The Quiet Tenant, and then I gobbled up Our Last Resort. So before we could dig into all the fun things, tell our listeners about Our Last Resort.
Well, and thank you for your kind words about both books. Our Last Resort is the story of Frida and Gabriel, and they are two adults who travel to this beautiful hotel in the desert in Utah to try to rekindle their sibling relationship. And everything is going fine, not perfectly well, but fine, until a few days into their stay, a female guest turns up dead, evidently murdered. Gabrielle is going to quickly become the focus of the murder investigation because it is not the first time a woman has died in his midst. Frida and Gabrielle share a particularly strong and intense kind of bond, which is why it's going to be so hard for Frida to sort of ask herself what her brother is capable of. The reason they're so bonded is that they grew up in a cult in upstate New York together. So the novel is told in dual timelines. One of them is the contemporary timeline, the murder investigation at the hotel and its consequences. That timeline spans days. And then the other timeline is their childhood in the cult and their past. And that timeline spans years. And that little discrepancy was a very interesting exercise for me as a writer.
Interesting. Well, tell us about that because I love that dual timeline. I loved getting to know them as kids and then again as adults. Yeah, because that's different from the structure of The Quiet Tenant.
Exactly. So I don't know about you, but when I start a project, I always kind of go into it not thinking that anything is going to be hard. I just have this incredible amount of naivete, which I think is necessary for creativity. Because if we knew how hard it's going to be, we probably wouldn't do it or it would be too discouraging. And so I was thinking, well, I did multiple points of view with The Quiet Tenant. I want to try doing something new and different. Let me try doing dual timelines. One of my favorite crime novels ever, Luckiest Girl Alive by Jessica Knoll, has dual timelines, and I think it's a masterpiece. So I thought, very foolishly, I was like, let me try to do it too. And it was really interesting, but it was a challenge because I love getting to know my characters. And this was really like a boot camp of getting to know your characters because you get to write the children who would become these adults. And likewise, you have to make sure you write the adults who match these kids. It was very intense.
So when you go into a story, it sounds from what you're saying a little bit like you're not exactly like a you're not a big plotter. You don't know. And then when I say master, I mean like you're not somebody who just irons out every detail. You are
I'm
indeed a
not,
master, Clémence, in many things, but are you a plotter?
I'm not a plotter. Which doesn't mean that I go into it without any prep work.
Of course.
But I do not outline. I usually know how the book is going to start, the what if, the inciting incident. and I know how it's going to end, by which I mean more that I know how it's going to end character-wise. I know who is going to prevail and in which emotional manner they're going to prevail. From a plot point of view, I find it hard to plan what should happen once I'm 80 or 90,000 words in at the very beginning. I have no idea, you know? Um, I do some prep work. It's actually interesting. I was looking back into this craft book I like to use just this morning.
Yeah.
Um, it's called Story Genius. I'm sure you've encountered it.
I have it. I own it. Yes.
This is the book that taught me how to write, to be honest. I think I don't talk about it enough, but it's such a good book to understand the difference between a series of things that happen and a story. And
Interesting.
it,
Yeah.
yeah, and it has all these exercises and these questions that it makes you ask yourself. What does my character want? Why does she want it? What would it mean for her to get it? And those are not like story level answers. You know, she wants to win the Olympics. It's she wants to feel loved. You know, it's always emotional. And I try to do some amount of this prep work before I start writing.
Mhm.
And then I kind of keep doing it as I get further into the draft and I repitch myself. I repitch the novel to myself as I go. And I also refine the aesthetics and figure out what books I would like it to be like, you know?
Interesting. Like, explain what you mean by that. That's interesting. I've not heard that the aesthetic, the sort of
Yeah.
idea of book aesthetics.
Well, you know, at first when I'm starting a book, I'm really focused on story and character, right? But I think there is a thing where you then start to figure out what kind of book is this going to be? Which books am I going to be in conversation with? So, for example, with Our Last Resort, I mentioned Luckiest Girl Alive with the dual timelines. With The Quiet Tenant, I realized, well, this is a captivity story that is also character driven. You know, Misery by Stephen King has that vibe, right? So just trying to think of what what are my sort of two, three books that will give me the big themes and the big colors and shapes and sounds of this book. This is like something I got from, of all places, Gordon Ramsay's memoir that I that I read years and years ago. But he wrote something in it that said, before you open a restaurant, you should be able to see the restaurant in your head and to hear it and to smell it. And I feel like as I get further into a draft, I start to be able to picture the book and what kind of book it's going to be.
I love that. Okay, so when you say that you have an idea about how it ends, sort of emotionally in terms of the characters, does that give you a picture of sort of like I know when I start a book until actually the book I'm working on now, but generally I always have an idea of sort of some last pivotal plot, like the sort of ma the ending crisis or the and not necessarily how not the denouement exactly, but the moments before that. And is that what you mean by sort of like you have in a sense, or can you be more, can you explain what you mean?
Yes. Well, I mean, in terms of the main conflict of the novel, right? Like there's always going to be characters who end up in opposition to each other. I tend to know from the onset who I want to be okay in the end.
Yes,
Who's
yes.
going to be okay and who is not going to be okay. I usually have ideas for things I might want to put along the way in the middle. And then usually I do have some kind of a flavor of, like you said, that final sort of second to last breath,
Hmm.
right? That hairpin turn where after that everything comes to a head and then hopefully gets resolved. Um, but those things with me are subject to change as I find my way around the story.
And have you found that has happened to you when you're writing that they have changed?
Oh my God, yes. First of all, most of the things that I picture using in the middle, I never end up using.
Yeah.
They're just kind of like things that I aim for, like when you're hiking, like like the colors on the trees, it kind of like allow me to head into the right direction.
Right.
But then I just never end up using them because it's not exactly what the story needs. And I think for me, the most important thing I have found is to try to stay close to the story and listen to it and not try too hard to take it into a specific direction. When I do that, my characters stop acting like people and they start acting like characters.
Yeah, it's
And
actually, yeah, that's brilliant advice. So how do you do that? Like what's sort of, what's the listening? Because I mean, that's a really hard thing to do to shut out the noise. So yeah,
yeah,
what are your tricks for that?
it's super hard. I'm still learning, to be honest with you. But I have learned that for me, it's trying to, as much as I rely on word counts to get the work done, I am learning that I have to divorce myself a little bit from the actual word count on the page. And I cannot go too fast.
Mhm.
Um, I can physically write 1,500, 2,000 words a day. I can do it. I'm a journalist by trade. If I have to write a certain amount of words, I will do it. That's fine. But it will cause me to kind of lose touch with the story. A little bit like if you're on a bike and suddenly you go downhill and your feet kind of lose the pedal,
Right.
you know? That's okay though. Sometimes I need to go fast to kind of get further into the story. But then I will like need to take a break, catch my breath, look around and see if I've gone into the right direction.
Mhm.
Um, for me, I have found also that I tend to at least think about revisions as I go. Sometimes I revise as I go. I think more and more I'm revising as I'm going, which used to not be the case at all. Um, but at least I think once you get more experience, it's hard not to always think about what you
Yeah.
will do in revisions, right? But have you found the same thing?
I mean, it's funny. I've had a problem with losing track of the petals, if you will. I think in every book I've ever written, I have 20 or 30, sometimes 40,000 words of just that end up in the trash because I'm like caught up in the moment of the work, and then I'm like, whoa, 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 where am I? This is not where I'm supposed to be. So I think the slowing down thing has been really important for me, and that means sometimes backing up, and in that process, I do like to sort of revise and clean it up, and for me revision also means going deeper, right, in the characters, which I think which is amazing you're doing that, in your first books, because I think it took me a dozen books to get to the point where I was like, what's actually happening inside this character right this minute. But
It's
so
all thanks to Story Genius. I
I
wouldn't have
love
been
that.
able to do it without
Okay,
it.
tell us. I know I have this book on my shelf. I'm looking over to see if I can actually spot it. But tell us who writes that. I can't remember.
It's Lisa Crone.
Okay.
That's her name.
Okay.
Story Genius is how to use brain science to go beyond outlining and write a riveting novel. And there's an asterisk, and it says, before you waste 3 years writing 327 pages that go nowhere.
Yes, I think right. I've had three. I think I have done exactly that. Well, that's fun. It's really neat to hear people talk about sort of the things that they use. I think we have a lot of aspiring authors who listen to the podcast, and a lot of people who just want to understand exactly how this works. So that's fun. Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
Um,
I think with craft books, it's a bit like, do you remember around 2015 or 2016 how suddenly there were all these studio workouts and that were like concentrated around one activity? Like it was boxing or rowing or bikes or treadmills. And you realized if you did a bunch of them that they were all roughly the same thing. I don't mean that in a bad thing, in a bad way, but they were all a way to get you to do some cardio and some strength,
right,
like and alternating between the two. And all you had basically the goal was to find the one that worked for you,
right.
right? They all kind of accomplished the same thing. They all kind of taught you the same thing, but you had to find the format, the one that was fun for you. And I think craft books are exactly like that. Like find your craft book, find the one that speaks to you, and then just keep using it, keep relying on it. I write others. But this is the one, like in terms of actually getting the work done, that I always go back to. And
I,
then on writing by Stephen King, What I Need to Learn.
Oh,
Is
I
the
know.
most
On That is one of my favorites too. I mean, that's less a craft book and more like a this is your lifestyle book, but
yes.
I do love that. That's a wonderful one. So, I mean, people talk about, very candidly often on the podcast, particularly after writing book two, how that sophomore book feels, how hard it is because of course, and I don't know the story of The Quiet Tenant in terms of publication, but that you have like sort of your you can months and months and years to write the first book, and then they're like, and now we would like the second book in within one year. Can you tell us about how that was for you?
It is certainly, it's interesting. Like your second book is the first one you write with people in the room with you, metaphorically speaking, right? And it does changes things. It simply does. Even, and I thought I would be better at shutting out the noise. I don't know why I thought I would be better at it. But I guess it's a moment where I lacked self-knowledge a little bit. I thought, yeah, no problem. Mm, I think it's because as a journalist, I was so used to writing publicly and ignoring the comments, because if you're in journalism and you read the comments on your article, you're going to quit. So, I thought I would be so used to it that it wouldn't really affect me, but it just changes everything. And even just the mere fact of being under contract also changes how you write, structurally speaking. For example, so when I wrote The Quiet Tenant, I didn't have an agent and I didn't have an editor. And so I wrote by myself for a whole year before I showed the manuscript to the agent who became my agent. And now I want to utilize that partnership a little earlier on in the game because it's great to be able to send pages to your agent, to pitch an idea to your editor, and to not have to go through the agony for months and months of not knowing if this is even anything, you
Right.
know? So it's great to be able to feel like you're on some rails, but it does mean that, well, my first 50 pages, for example, I'm going to start reworking them quite early on even if I know they will change later, but I'm not showing my agent a first draft,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
that, no one sees the first draft, not
Right.
even my husband, and he's stuck with me. But no one sees that, and so the Quiet Tenant, for example, I wrote the first draft without looking back too much. Now I tend to look back a lot more and to try to shape things a little earlier on. So that's one thing. In terms of timing, I was pretty lucky in that sense because I wrote The Quiet Tenant in terms of the work I did on my own in a year.
Yeah.
So that didn't make the deadline too daunting. One big change though was that I had a day job when The Quiet Tenant came out as a journalist. And then I realized that I can write and have a day job, but it was getting hard to write and have a day job and be published
Yeah.
at the same time, like being a writer and being an author and being a journalist
Yep.
um, got hard. And so I made the choice to go freelance as a journalist a bit more than a year ago, actually, because I felt that I had to be able to as much, to take a bit more time with the books and just to kind of handle my time and my attention a little better.
So how do you sort of I mean if you when you were working or even now as doing freelance sort of how do you sort of separate those two things because they're very different but they're both writing. So I imagine in some ways they do exhaust some of the same resources.
What's funny is I never felt too much that my journalism and my fiction came from the same place.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I totally understand how it could be that way because they're both writing. So obviously, if my job was to do some people's taxes, for example, they would definitely be more separate. But I think it's because fiction to me has always felt like a fun break from journalism because you can mix and because you are, at the end of the day, it's my book. And even though I work collaboratively with my agent and my editor, it's my stuff, right? I decide. And I mean, I listen to my agent and my editor all the time, but it's my choice to listen.
Yeah.
When you're working as a journalist, you're writing for a title. So understandably, it's not your show, right?
Right.
There's a style guide and there are other, things to take into account, just depending on like you are writing to provide a product for a newspaper or a website. And so for me, I've always felt like they're quite different exercises. I will say though that I thought I would freelance more, but so far I've been very busy with book stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it's like, it's not just the writing of a book, and being a published author, it's the everything in between that is like the interviews and the press and the edits and then the page proofs, and then all the while like
Yeah.
sort of mixing those in with, with writing whatever is next. It can't, and it's a little bit it's a little discombobulating when you're pulled out of the book you're working on. I'm experiencing this right now, to go back to the book that you feel like is finished, but it's not quite finished because you're doing page proofs or whatever last minute things. And then to talk about, I think it's interesting, like, I don't know if you feel this way, but to be talking about the last resort when you're clearly already, you've written now another book that is sort of probably a little more, or has been at least in the last 6 months, front of mind.
Yes, I know it's so weird. I never used to understand, right, when musicians would say, like when they had new music coming out, this was in the time of CDs. I don't know now, they might release faster. But I remember my favorite French singer would say, I recorded this CD 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so now I'm thinking about other things. But it is interesting trying to hold everything in your mind. That's another difference with a second book. It's the first time you're trying to hold two books in your mind.
Mhm.
When I wrote The Quiet Tenant, it was like a tunnel, right?
Well, and yeah, exactly. And one of the things I remember you saying, and I'm trying to think if you said this, or I read it somewhere, about how you had taken this vacation with your parents and your sister wasn't there. I think I'm remembering this correctly. So it was just
Yes.
you and your parents, and you were in some desert spot, and sort of that is where the Our Last Resort was born. Can you tell us? I'm curious about this story, and also just how ideas sort of happen for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that anecdote is in the press notes
Okay.
we sent
Okay.
with the
Yeah.
book. That is how I came up with the idea for Our Last Resort. Basically, I was trying to think of what to write next. And The Quiet Tenant is set in the fall and in the winter in upstate New York.
Yeah.
So it's cold, it's icy, it's snowy. The night falls at 5 p.m. The sun sets at 5. It's also The Quiet Tenant is a book that has very simple setting. It's a garden shed, there's a house, and there's a restaurant, and that's essentially it.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, for my next book, I want to do something different. I'm learning that that's always how I think. I always come up with the next thing in reaction to the thing I just wrote.
Hmm.
And so I thought, well, I would like to go somewhere beautiful and warm. And my mind went back to this beautiful hotel in the desert in Utah that I went to with my parents when I was 18.
Hmm.
That was years and years ago because I'm 33 now. And it was a gorgeous place. It was the most mesmerizing place I'd ever seen. And it was also incredibly isolated. So isolated that we almost never found it and went to the Holiday Inn because we were losing daylight and we were in the desert. And it was so intriguing. What I remembered the most about it when I started thinking again was just this mix of beauty and menace. This was not a place that you could easily escape, for example. You're surrounded by the desert, which is a very inhospitable environment. And the contrast between those two things, the beauty and the luxury and the comfort, and the hostile nature all around us was very interesting. And so I thought, well, what if I set a murder story in a hotel? And I thought, well, I'm always trying to plumb the big question of my work is how much do you ever really know about the people you love?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what if the murder at the hotel causes people to re-examine their past and like say a brother and a sister, and she has to wonder what he's capable of. And that sounded interesting to me, but I thought, well, in real life, if someone you love gets credibly accused of murder, sure, for like a day or two or a week, you're gonna say no, there's no way. But then when confronted with evidence, you're gonna start to like say, well, maybe, I guess. And so I thought, well, there really has to be more of a bond between these two that
Hmm.
would create a stronger like mental barrier. And that would mean that accepting the person's possible guilt would be the end of the world, right? I needed it to be just the emotional stakes to be really much higher. And that's when I decided that these two had grown up in a cult together because I thought that will seal your bond for life.
Yeah, and it's particularly how they leave, right? I mean, that we're not
Hmm.
have to read the book to know, but the circumstances under which they leave the cult really does sort of solidify their bond. And then it's interesting because we're so, I think in so many stories we're really very used to reading about these dynamics, often in a husband and wife, right? Particularly because they're very isolated from kind of everybody else except themselves. And I love that they're a couple that they get a little some sideways glances, from hotel and staff and whatever, and that there is the question because they're actually not related. They're not blood siblings, that they're cult siblings. There
Yeah.
is this question of like whether or not, why they never became more. I love all the sort of layers of that because it's a new, we have those people in our lives. I mean, some of us do that are, that it's sort of like, so well that people are like, why aren't you guys together? And yet
Yeah.
all these things that you sort of look at them and think, oh no, like that guy's like my brother, And I love,
Yeah.
was that originally in your head that they were siblings?
Yeah, totally. It was always the case. And then I thought it was more interesting if they were siblings sort of by choice, right? So, like you said, they're not biologically related. And I thought, well, that's more interesting. I find in a novel anything that is a choice rather than a act of God is much more interesting. Because, then you have to think about who you invited into your life. It's like if you're dealt a relative who does terrible things, well, it sucks, but in a way, it was just bad luck of the draw, right? But what if it's someone you invited into your life? Then it would raise more questions about yourself and stuff. So I thought that was more interesting. I am also always fascinated by stories of people who just seem to have this draw to each other that doesn't fit into any of the formats that society offers. It's not blood family. It's not a romantic love, but it is something. It's like two magnets, And I don't know. I always love stories like that. I don't know why.
Well, I think it makes sense, and I like that. I like what you're saying about sort of like the act of God, because in this case, it really is a choice. Frida has a choice. They have a choice to follow each other out of that cult, which, all of that backstory is super interesting. And of course, leaving a cult has, all the ramifications of the cult. I'm curious to know, like, when you thought about the story originally, was the cult in it? Um,
Yeah.
okay,
Yes.
it
So
was.
that was really that became the what if that I started working with was really what if two chosen siblings, I think I decided that early on, who grew up in a cult together, go to this hotel and then a murder happens, causes them to have to re-examine the past. They're so desperate to forget, basically.
Yeah.
Um, I love books about cults. I'm very intrigued by cults. I've been since I was a kid. I think I had the same reaction to cults as I did to serial killers, which was that when I found out they existed, it had never crossed my mind to imagine anything like this, right? Like it just doesn't make sense. But when
Right.
I find out they existed, I remember I watched a segment on TV. It was like a French version of 60 Minutes, and they had this segment about cults. And I think the feeling I had was like, oh, yeah, obviously, of course that would happen. Because I think cults are this sort of toxic, predatory offshoot of something that we're all involved in, which is trying to live together, trying to live as a group. And it's hard to live as a collective. And cults put their own predatory spin on that.
And there is something I can, you can also understand, and you explore this as well, sort of the appeal of that
Yeah.
group lifestyle and how it gets unfortunately twisted by one, person's power, hunger so there's a lot of really interesting sort of psychology behind how people end up there and if they leave, how they leave, and it's like, it's their story forever. I mean, you don't leave a cult without the cult, being still a part of you.
Oh my God, yes. Well, and something that always intrigued me about cults as well was that they tend to prey on otherwise pretty good qualities of people, right? The desire to believe in something, existentialism, asking yourself how you want to exist in the world and what you want to do, and trying to be intentional about things. And, those are not bad things,
No.
but they make, they use that to manipulate people.
Yeah, and it's also usually people are sort of jaded by the world the way it is, and a lot of us are looking for ways to sort of simplify and lead a sort of more, more holistic, honest, healthy life. But yeah, but like you said, then they take that and then it gets twisted into something that is much uglier and rife with story, right? It's the reason that cults are in stories is they're so fascinating.
Yes, no, absolutely. It makes for good literature. Well, little worlds too that have their own rules and hella power dynamics, and it just seems like when you're trying to fill your sandbox when you start working on a book, this seemed like a pretty rich one.
And actually, you do the same thing in the resort, right? Because there's other guests at the resort, and then there's also that it's a little bit of a it's in its own little locked world too, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, that is interesting because it was kind of an aesthetic parallel that wasn't, I didn't really realize before I started working on the book. And then I kept like almost bumping into it, writing the book. For example, Frida, at one point, she sees people lining up for food at the hotel because there's a buffet. There's usually not a buffet, but after there's a police investigation, everything is kind of thrown into disarray. So the breakfast suddenly is a buffet. And she sees people lining up for their breakfast. And of course, it reminds of being in the cult and collective meals and stuff like that. And it was interesting because, yeah, suddenly you have people in this hotel in the desert that looks a little bit like a compound.
Right.
And I was quite happy with that because it worked out so well.
Mhm.
They are almost physically put back into a bizarre version of that past that is about to kind of rebuild itself around.
And the juxtaposition between sort of the scarcity of food and resources in the cult and the like plenitude, luxury of the resort was also super fun. Yeah, you did, consciously or not, you did all these beautiful sort of balancing of those worlds, which was so fun. Now, I know a lot of times you can't and you're not prepared to, but I always like to ask if you can tell us a little bit about what you're working on now.
Of course. I am working on another thriller, another work of psychological suspense. Um, I will say that it's an idea that I've had for a few years now. I think I had the idea for the one I'm working on now around the same time. I mean, I think before The Quiet Tenant came out, basically. I knew I was going to want to write it, but it took me time to figure out how to make the idea work, but I stuck with it. I'm very excited about
Yay, that's so exciting. Okay, well, tell us now, Clemence, we can follow you on social media. Tell us where to find you, so people can keep track of all these fabulous projects.
Thank you. I am, in terms of social media, I am mainly on Instagram. My handle is my first name, last name. So Clémence Michallon, there you go, unblurred, without the accent on the E. We can forget about that. But that's my handle, first name, last name. I am also on Substack. I have an author newsletter, which I need to update, actually. And it's clemensmichelon.substack.com. And I have an author website if people want to read up on sort of my bio or see my journalism portfolio. And it's clemensmichelon.com.
And I'm going to spell it. It's Clemence is Clemence, and then Michelon is Michallon. So for those of you that are listening to us, and I'm sure you could search The Quiet Tenant, you could Google Our Last Resort, and you would absolutely find her. We will be giving away a final copy of Our Last Resort, and so go follow Clemence. Go look at this gorgeous cover, which shows that luxurious resort in the desert. It was so fun to get a chance to talk to you today, Clemence. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your great questions and for having me on the show. I can't believe this is over already. I could have, it went by so fast.
They always go by so fast. And they're always like, keep them to 20 minutes. And I'm like, that's impossible. There's no
Oh,
way.
that's
I barely get
impossible.
going at 20 minutes. So,
Oh, yeah.
everyone, thank you so much for joining Killer Women with Clemence Michelon, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye bye.